Renae Skarin, thank you so much for joining us on Highest Aspirations.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, we've actually chatted with your colleague, Crystal Gonzalez. That was probably a year and a half or 2 years ago. I'm really bad with time, but it was a while ago now. But we had a chance to catch up with her about high quality instructional materials for multilingual learners, which obviously is a hugely important topic for everybody, and particularly for the work that you and I are both doing. And I wanted to follow up on this topic with you and kind of get a little bit current to where we are now and talk about some connections between or with the teacher shortages and the burnout that we're seeing,
Mm.
and how that kind of relates to instructional materials. So we're going to kind of take this in a little bit of a different direction than the one we did with Crystal, but I'll link to that episode as well because that was also really good to learn, kind of get the general basics about this. But let's
Mm.
set the stage a little bit. As we settle into a new school year, right? We're recording this in mid-September. Where do you think we stand right now on these issues, just in general, to kind of set the stage, and then we'll get specific?
Mm. Yeah, well, thanks for raising the issue, Steve. Yeah, in our nationwide survey, we did a survey of teachers during the pandemic, actually, and we found that 70% of the teachers surveyed didn't feel fully prepared to teach multilingual learners. And the pandemic has only exacerbated that issue with multilingual learners for various reasons. Um, they were disproportionately affected by the additional gaps in their opportunities to learn during this time. And so teachers, with connectivity issues, with issues of access to devices, with many other issues that they were facing, teachers were really, finding it hard to find ways to keep students up to grade level standards. And of course, learners were finding it hard to learn in a new language virtually.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, there are likely a great number of benefits that came out of this time. A lot of resilience was developed, and a lot of those things can be built on. But teachers are now being tasked with to feel what they are called learning loss,
Mm-hmm.
and being asked to accelerate learning for kids so that they can catch up, when they weren't fully supported to do that before the pandemic.
Right.
So it's not time for business as usual. Teachers, yes, are burning out, and it's I think it's just shining a light on the ways that they weren't supported before, and now it's kind of getting to a little bit more of a dire situation with with this task to get kids up to speed. So we need to find better ways to support teachers, and our mission and vision is that we provide teachers with good quality educative curriculum that helps them create the optimal conditions for learning, and sort of provides the octane that teachers need, with those evidence-based practices that provide educators the support to get kids to where they need to be. So yeah, I think we need to do everything that we can do to provide them with those resources and help them to get to where we need to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the work that you're doing is extremely important because it hits right, onto the issues that you just mentioned. I want to go back a little bit to that survey, and I know you've done a lot of research here, and we've done surveys on our own and have found similar results, although ours have likely been a lot smaller than yours. But what you basically found is that teachers, as you mentioned, they don't have a positive perception of instructional materials to support multilingual learners. And these are people in the field doing the work that don't feel like they are adequately prepared or have the content or the materials they need to support multilingual learners. Where do you think specifically the gaps are here? I mean, what are teachers saying? What is it that they need? Have you been able to kind of get specific on that?
Oh yeah, I mean, we drilled down to some really specific questions around what supports teachers are finding lacking in their materials and so forth. I'll start out by saying only 30%, 36% of teachers surveyed are using their instructional materials provided by their district on a daily basis.
Yeah, we'll get to that in a second. That sounds familiar, but continue.
So that means 64% are not. So, and a lot of the open-ended questions we provided in the survey showed that they're creating their own materials because they're using materials that they find on the internet. And many cited lack of quality supports to meet the needs of their students, especially their multilingual learners. Some of the gaps they cited were there's not effective scaffolds for multilingual learners built into the curriculum, so they have to build those in. They said that their materials are not culturally responsive or sustaining, that they don't reflect the diversity of students in their
Which is
classrooms.
a huge buzzword right now. Not a buzzword, it's really important, but something that is expected, and yet it's not provided.
It's not provided. Yeah. We are finding that content developers are making an effort to try and shift that in their materials. But as it stands right now, a lot of the materials that are in the hands of teachers are not culturally supportive of their students. They said also that there's no differentiation supports to help them to meet the students where they're at. And there's not a lot of support for formatively assessing students' language and content development. So if they don't know how to assess where students are at with their language around the disciplinary subject, they don't know how to get them to where they need to be.
Right.
So yeah, there's a lot of there are quite a few areas where teachers cited lack of support, and that they're building in those things themselves.
Right. And I'll highlight three before I get into my next that you just mentioned. I mean, scaffolding, differentiation, and formative assessments. I'm kind of laughing uncomfortably because those are like crucial key things that you need, and they need to obviously be research based, which brings me to my next point. Like when I was teaching, and I don't necessarily think that this is a good thing, what I was doing, but like the 64% of teachers who thought that their curriculum that they were provided was not doing the job when they were working with their students, I was one of those people. I was one of the 64% who created my own instructional materials. It was extremely time consuming. It solved the problem partially. I can't say that it was all research based and all sort of vetted, except by me. It was satisfying, but it was unsustainably time consuming. And over time, I think it kind of led to, after 17 years of teaching, it was one of the factors I think that made me kind of move on. I mean, I ended up in a really good place and still supporting educators right now. I'm really happy where I am, but it was definitely a part of it.
Yeah.
Have you found that a lot of the teachers are doing that now, 64% according to your study? What had been the results on this? I mean, like, is this, and when I ask that, I'm asking really in two ways. One, are the materials that they're creating, particularly for multilingual learners in this case, which is even more challenging than what I had to do, are they effective? Number one, and number two, is it are they kind of research based in a way that it's going to really make a difference in students' lives?
Okay. Well, let me start by citing a number. 70% of the teachers that we surveyed do not feel fully prepared to
Right.
support multilingual learners in learning grade level content. So if they are not professionally prepared through their pre-service or in-service programs, if they're not professionally prepared to teach them, how can they possibly develop coherent quality supports for multilingual learners in the curriculum that they're developing? And it's not to blame teachers at all. They obviously don't feel that those supports are present in the curriculum that the district has provided, right? So what teachers need is coherence in curriculum, and they need a curriculum that provides sustained language and content support in a coherently designed unit and year curriculum. But I wonder how well they can accomplish this with all the other responsibilities put on them, with the lack of professional development around
Hmm.
the diversity of students in their classroom. I mean, some of the teachers we surveyed said they're spending 7 to 12 hours a week developing their own materials
Yeah, it sounds
alongside.
familiar. Sounds right.
Right? I remember I did the same thing as a teacher. I was trained in language acquisition, so it was a little bit of a different situation. But we're talking about teachers who were not necessarily trained in language acquisition in any robust way. And so alongside all of their other bureaucratic and educational duties, they are spending 7-12 hours a week at home,
Hmm.
trying to come up with, searching the internet for content that will meet the standards, the grade level standards, but that those materials are not necessarily coherently designed.
Hmm.
So, what we know about multilingual learners is that they need multiple opportunities to use language, to be exposed to language, to have opportunities to talk using that disciplinary language, and to develop that language over time within the disciplinary content. But teachers don't necessarily have the expertise to build a kind of curriculum like that allows for those multiple opportunities, and for the development of the language needed to grapple with and talk about and generate ideas about content
Right, right.
area.
Yeah. So let me preface what I'm about to say with repeating what you had said a minute ago, which is that this is not teachers' fault. It's that they're doing the best they can in whatever category they're in, right? And I was one of those teachers um, in that one of those groups. And so just to like recap before I ask you the next question, we have 1/3 approximately of teachers who are using the curriculum that's provided to them by their district, which doesn't seem to meet the needs. 70% of or there I'm getting the percentages wrong, but it doesn't seem to meet the needs of multilingual learners, right?
Yeah.
And so you have 2/3 of teachers saying, you know what, I'm going to create my own materials because I feel like I can do better by my students by investing extra time into creating supports for them that may not be, as you said, coherent through no fault of their own, but they have a challenge that they need to solve that is in front of them right now, and they're doing their best to solve it. So
Yeah.
given that, we have two tracks, right, that really are not necessarily effective. So
Yeah.
given that challenge, what role do stakeholders play in solving this problem? So like I think we can probably take teachers off the table for a minute. We're talking about administrators, PD providers, content creators, the folks who are really trying to get teachers to in a position where they need to be to serve their multilingual learners.
That's a really great question. And, look, before the pandemic, there was a 30-point gap in educational attainment between multilingual learners and students who speak English at home as a primary language at home. So that means that we're not currently providing the resources that teachers need to effectively teach grade level content to multilingual learners. A 30-point gap is unacceptable. So what role do stakeholders play? I think that first of all, of course, we need content developers really paying attention to this and bringing in the right folks, the right experts to help them to design content that meets the needs of the diversity of students in their classrooms. They need people that have expertise in cultural responsiveness. How do you design
Mm-hmm.
curriculum? I mean, I will say, having worked in the field for a long time, most content developers come from white middle class backgrounds,
Yeah.
privileged backgrounds. And I don't say that to blame anybody, but I say that to point, to kind of shine a light on the fact that we're not bringing a lot of diversity into, designing curriculum. So we need to bring in those folks that have expertise in these areas. We need to bring in folks into the design world that understand multilingual learners and how to develop coherent curriculum that is supportive of those learners. So that's one thing. We also need educational leaders at the state level And they need to ensure that the state adoption lists of approved materials are not only aligned to grade level standards, that's just the base, the basic, but they also need to make sure that those materials are reflective of the diversity of the students that are in our, in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And multilingual learner population is growing in states like South Carolina. In the last 20 years, the multilingual learner population has grown by 400%.
Yeah.
So we're seeing, states that have never seen this diversity, at least, non-European diversity, suddenly have an influx of diverse students from all over the world, and they don't know how to support them. So we need states that are looking at the diversity of students and saying, okay, we need to make sure that we adopt curriculum that is reflective of the cultural needs, the linguistic needs, and the assets of the students in our classrooms today. And then educational leaders at the district and school level need to develop better adoption criteria. So, it's a lot of times the IMETs or, these instructional materials evaluation tools don't reflect, they're mostly looking at alignment to grade level standards. Well, that's really important. But we also need to look at, is this reflective of my students' needs and assets? Is it inclusive? Does it engage the students that are currently in our classrooms? Is it supportive of teachers in differentiating instruction for those students and being culturally responsive to those students? And then teachers need quality, job-embedded, curriculum-specific professional development opportunities, and opportunities to develop professional communities where they can support each other
Mm-hmm.
in growth in their instructional practices. So there's a lot that can be done across the board to make sure that we get better materials into the hands of teachers and kids, and that we support teachers in good instructional practices that are reflective of our kids.
Yeah, and it's a world that should all be connected. There shouldn't be silos, right? As I heard you speak and kind of go from state education agencies to local education agencies to districts to teachers to school. I mean, that it needs to be connected in some way. And I think historically a lot of these decisions have been made in silos, and maybe in some ways we could have gotten away with it, although it probably still wasn't the best situation because
Yeah.
like you say, you mentioned a great example of South Carolina that has really become a very different demographic in a very positive way. I mean, it should be something that, and we talk about taking an asset-based approach all the time, but at the same time, if you have a sort of core of teachers and educators who are not trained, no fault of their own in this, you got to make some adjustments. Just talking about state education agencies and local education agencies, I'm curious. I'm guessing that you have, but have you shared these survey results with them? And if so, what has been the reaction? I'd love to hear kind of what what the reaction was to that or has been.
Yeah, so I will say that we're at the beginning stages of sharing these results. We have a content developer webinar coming up in October where we will be inviting leaders in the content developer world. So those publishers, the content leads and CAOs and those folks making decisions in those content developer orgs, we'll be inviting them to the table and presenting these results to them in October. I believe it's October 3rd. And we have begun to share those results with states. We published an article, a research brief in EdTrust West research on their website.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of lays out the California results. They're very concerned right now with what's happening with the math framework and advocating for the math framework to be very reflective of the students that we serve in California. So we've published there, and we are about to release this month our nationwide survey results in a research report that will be published on the English Learners Success Forum website. We will then be sharing more widely those results in various webinars and op-eds. We have, EdSource has an op-ed. We have published some op-eds thus far around those results, but we will be publishing those results more widely as we, sort of go through the steps of, disseminating. We are working with state leaders right now in various states, Massachusetts, Delaware, Rhode Island, and we've been sharing those with our close partners, the states that we are working with, and we will continue to do so. We will be at the EdTrust West Equity Forum coming up in a week's time, where we'll be sharing those with advocates and educational leaders at that forum. And we'll continue to find venues to share these results and to really, hopefully generate some, a little octane around, hey, we need to really make sure that we're paying attention to adoption, and that we're, no more business as usual. Like, we really need to kind of step up our adoption, criteria development, make sure that we're doing the right thing on that end for students.
Yeah, and I mean, I think for what it's worth, I think you're doing all the right things. I mean, it's not an accident that I found out the work that I found out about it through EdSource, just because I have my finger on the pulse of what's happening, as many do. And in some small way, I hope that this conversation and whatever comes from it helps to kind of amplify that and give you a little bit more octane, as you've put it, because I think it's really, really important. And we'll link to, we always share the information and the work that you're doing on our community brief, which goes out every Friday to anybody who's a member of our community. So we'll continue to do that. And we'll continue to amplify any of the resources that you're putting out there. And if anything that you have just mentioned has already happened in the past, when people are listening to this podcast, we'll make sure we link to it so that they can access it. So you did mention the California math framework, and I know that's kind of a bright spot, at least the beginning, perhaps, of a bright spot. So what is the key to success of programs like these, or at least getting them off the ground, and how can they sort of be replicated in other places? I mean, how is that a bright spot, and what can people learn from it?
Yeah. So the California math framework, I mean, we're really excited about what's happening there. We know that many of our advocates in the field have been really pushing on the framework developers and the California DOE to ensure that the diversity of students are reflected in that, and that more equity, more attention to equity is brought to math teaching and learning, including the creation and adoption of instructional materials that are reflective of the many, the huge population of multilingual learners in California. So, and one of the bright spots there too is the taking an assets-based perspective on multilingualism and multiliteracy, and really asking, educational organizations to really support this idea of multilingualism. That multilingualism is a benefit, it's an asset. It not only helps individuals in many different ways, but it also supports the state and to not only celebrating diversity, but making our system stronger. So I think there's that, the celebration of that, and the support for that. But it also asks content developers to step up to the plate. Chapter 13 is on instructional materials, and it says, look, this is what we need to pay attention to in instructional materials development, and equitable access to curriculum should be a priority.
Right.
So how can we do that? We make sure that those materials are reflective of, they're culturally responsive. They provide differentiation supports. They include scaffolds for language. They pay attention to, the new, the next generation science standards, as well as state standards, are very supportive of, they're very language rich, I will say. They ask teachers to teach, skills that are very linguistically heavy, right? If you're arguing, you really need to know how to argue well, right, within a discipline. So how do we then build those supports into curriculum and ensure that teachers are provided with the educative supports they need to understand how to help students to learn how to argue within math learning. So I think if we use that as sort of like as a sort of guiding post for what the rest of the states can do, I think what this tells me too is that advocates need to be involved. They need to put pressure on these educational organizations to ensure that the students' needs and assets are met and understood. So the role of advocacy organizations is really important. Just the kind of putting, creating a set of guiding posts for those developing and teaching, adopting content that is reflective of the needs of students.
Right. Yeah, and that kind of leads me to everything you just said, leads me kind of my last two questions, and maybe I'll kind of preview them because I think they're connected. I didn't necessarily see the connection before, but now I do based on what you just said. The first question I want to ask you is about funding, and then I want to talk a little bit after that about advocacy, because I think they are connected, maybe perhaps now more than ever. And the first piece of this is that we're dealing with all these challenges. You've said a few times that it can't be business as usual anymore. And if it's not going to be business as usual anymore, it's going to require an investment, both a financial investment, then an investment in time, and an investment in advocacy and everything else. Simultaneously, while that's all going on, there's a lot of funding out there right now, and a lot of it in the form of ESSER funds. There's been, in fact, we interviewed two folks from TNTP a couple weeks ago about policy analysts about ESSER funds, and I think it's something like, according to some of the research they've done, something like 7 million. Don't quote me on that number, but there is a huge number of English learners, multilingual learners, in districts who have not used any of their ESSER funding to support multilingual learning programs. So the money's out there. It's not being used in many cases in the right way. Some folks have cracked the code, some districts, and they're doing it really well. So my question to you is, to solve the problems that we are talking about, have districts adequately tapped into those funds to mitigate this lack of high quality instructional materials, and the burnout that it's causing for a lot of teachers who are spending all of this time trying to create these materials while also teaching at a very challenging time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you're right there. From what we're seeing, we are not seeing ESSER funds being used for sort of bolstering our systems to create better opportunities for multilingual learners. I think a lot of folks right now, and rightly so, are focused on social emotional learning. They're focused on other issues, trying to effects of health and so forth, which I think is really important. But as you said, we need to look systemically at what was going on before the pandemic, what the pandemic shone the light on, and what we need to do to systemically change to support the needs of all of our students. So I don't think we are set up to do that at the moment. And I think that's why people are at a loss of how to, use those ESSER funds effectively. So when I say systemically, I'm thinking about, okay, where do we see students were suffering before the pandemic? We know that there were inadequate materials, that teachers had inadequate training to teach multilingual learners, that states were not necessarily providing them with the resources that they need to do that effectively, and that we were not seeing a decrease in those educational opportunity gaps for students, despite many years of efforts on the parts of teachers and educational leaders. So we need to think really, we need to, put our heads together and think about, like, how can we create a system that is addressing those issues, maybe kind of dismantling some of the current structures, and really thinking about how we can rebuild our educational system to include the needs of all students. And that includes providing teachers with the support they need to teach them effectively. I mean, the bottom line is it's the students that are suffering, right? And those are that's what we're trying to do here, is teach students, right? So, how can we, the nitty gritty is like, how do we get down to creating systems that are supportive and high quality instructional materials and professional learning, curriculum specific professional learning that helps, teachers to understand how to teach the diversity of students. That's just like a baseline.
Right. Yeah. And like, so everything you just mentioned again kind of leads me to this next point about advocacy, and we can talk about advocacy in the form of advocacy groups. And you mentioned the importance of those, and those are crucial because teachers are so busy that to try to do some of that work is difficult. But given that we could probably be using more of these funds than we are to help support projects like the ones that you're talking about, or initiatives like the ones that you're talking about, how would you recommend, I'm listening to this podcast right now, I'm an EL specialist, I'm a teacher, I'm a principal, I'm someone in a school who's concerned with multilingual learners. And so I'm trying to get an idea of what I can do to get high quality instructional materials for multilingual learners into my school without going crazy myself as a teacher, or without knowing that all of my teachers are going crazy trying to create their own stuff. What can those folks do to help maintain this momentum right now? I mean, what's like the first step to try to help get a seat at the table and the advocacy table so that we can hold content creators and others accountable for their role in this work?
That's a really good question. And I think, teachers and educators that are really concerned with, what's happening in their system and how they can improve the system. First of all, find out when your adoptions are happening, right? When are your math adoptions happening? When are your ELA science adoptions happening? And then who's involved in that process? Who's at the table? Are representatives of the students that we're serving at the table? Are they EL specialists at the table? They understand the needs of their multilingual learners better than anybody. So how many of those people are at the table helping make those decisions? And then what are your criteria for adoption? What are you What tools are you using? What processes are you going through? I've heard of cases where, publishers have flown teachers down to Mexico and Tijuana and said, let's party and let me show you our materials in the meantime. And I've heard also just, okay, the three textbooks that we're going to choose from for math are in the library. Go make it, go look at them and you can put in a vote or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So, the processes for adoption are all over the
Yeah.
place.
Yep.
There are some rigorous processes at some districts, but in some states, and a lot more people are paying attention to this than previously. But I think we need to take a long, hard look. Who's at the table? What are our processes? Are our criteria rigorous? What tools are we using? How much time and resources are we, in this, like instructional materials adoption? It's a relatively cheap fix if you do it right,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's doesn't, in the large scheme of things, instructional materials, you have a textbook for 7 years. We get a lot of use out of it if we
Right.
do it right. And it can be very supportive of teachers if we do it right. But so, are we doing our due diligence and making sure that process is coherent, rigorous, robust, that the right people are at the table? Advocacy organizations should be shining a light on curriculum adoptions and saying, hey, we're going to make sure that these materials are the right materials for our kids. We should
Yeah.
have a say in this, right? We're taxpayers, we're paying for these textbooks. So everybody should be, scrutinizing this process and making sure that it's done right.
Yeah, all really great points. And I'll just say, if I could kind of go back in time to when I first started teaching, there's definitely some changes that I would make as a teacher and ask where, what we're doing here. Because for me, and this is one that you didn't mention in terms of criteria and adoption, it was always like, hey, we have like 2 weeks to spend all this money. What do you guys want? And meanwhile, you're in the middle of, maybe it's the beginning of the year, or you're busy because you're just teaching, and you don't have the time that you need to really get a seat at the table and really think about it. It was always kind of a last minute decision. And if I'm being perfectly honest, and I'll be totally transparent, I'm a little bit worried about that with ESSER funding, because at a certain point, they're talking about extending the deadline, but there is going to be a deadline at some point. And I
Right.
think the districts and the schools that aren't really thinking about this strategically in a way that we've talked about, um, are going to be in that position. And that's not a good position to be in. And I've seen it, just with, you can't just buy a program. I mean, I'm very proud of the work that we do at Ellevation, but what makes our product successful is districts that have a goal and a mission, just like any other product that they're using. And I just worry about that a little bit. So I would encourage kind of teachers who are maybe in my position when I first started to really try to pull back the curtain of what's going on there and get a seat at the table, make sure there are experts there, because in many cases, it's just not happening. And again, it could be a result of capacity or just everybody's busy. But these are really important decisions. So I appreciate you kind of bringing up those points.
Well, I'd love to add one more thing, and that is parent involvement.
Good
Like, what
point.
are parents saying? And are we making an effort to reach out to the parents of our multilingual learners and finding out what they need and what they're experiencing with their children's curriculum? And are they able to even help their kids with the curriculum that is being provided? Or is the curriculum provided in the language of the home?
Mm-hmm.
Is the curriculum, or is there an effort to reach out to parents and get their support with teaching kids content? And if parents don't even know what's happening in the classroom, don't even know what their kids are learning, because there's access issues, there's language barriers, and we haven't made an effort to cross those barriers. It's again, it's business as usual, but content developers need to play a big role in that. And I think they're starting to recognize that, and there's some efforts to create materials, that go home and help parents to understand what's happening with their kids' learning. But a lot more needs to be done in that
Yeah.
area.
Yep. Need more seats at the table, and they need to be full for sure. Okay, great. Well, as we wrap this up, Renae, I have two additional questions for you. These are questions that I ask everybody. And the first one is a question that I love asking because it helps me build my own personal library and hopefully it helps others as well. But um, I'm curious if there's a book or any other resource that's kind of influenced you either personally or professionally that you'd like to share with listeners.
Yeah, I would love to share this book that is kind of like my Bible, and you can kind of see that I've got a lot of little sticky notes at pages that are really that so this
For
book is
for people listening, Renae is showing me a book right now that definitely has a lot of sticky notes in it. And what's it called? What's it called, Renae?
It's called Amplifying the Curriculum, and it's edited by Aida Walkey and George Bunch. Aida Walkey is with West Ed.
Yep.
She's the developer of the QTEL program, Quality Teachers for English, Quality Teaching for English Learners. And George Bunch teaches at UC Santa Cruz. And this really helps folks to understand how you design learning opportunities for multilingual learners in our classrooms, meaning that one of the big, sort of ideas in there is coherence across the curriculum, language development over time, spiraled opportunities to grapple with language and content, and lots of other things. And each of the chapters, in addition to the sort of main theoretical kind of basis for that comes in the first chapter, the rest of the chapters are written by practitioners who have utilized this model in various classrooms, science, history, ELA, math, and help to understand, kind of that architecture that is supportive of the diversity of students in your classroom, and the architecture that is, primarily it's about coherence, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's providing a coherent learning experience, an engaging learning experience, an exciting learning experience, and an agentive learning experience. We didn't talk a lot about agency. That was another thing that we found in our survey, is that teachers said, no, my curriculum does not offer, opportunities for students to learn autonomously or agentively, or
Right,
to
right.
really reflect on their own learning very well, their own language learning as well as content learning. And so this is really provides a model for like how we can do that effectively, create those coherent learning and exciting and engaging learning experiences. So that's my plug for Aida and George Bunch's book.
Well, that's great. And I think that fills in, like you said, a lot of the gaps in our conversation because I could definitely go down a rabbit hole right now and talk for another hour about structure versus agency and how students need agency and metacognition and everything else. But I won't. Maybe we'll talk about that another time.
Yeah,
Um,
geek out
that's
on that.
great. And I also love books that are set up that way, kind of like set up by, major important experts in the field and then have that practitioner point of view throughout. Those are always my favorites. So thank you for sharing that. And then my last question is you mentioned a lot of resources and a lot of opportunities to learn more about what you're doing. Anything you mentioned we'll link to, but in general, what's the best way for people? Like, is there a one-stop shop where people can go to learn more about the work that you're doing, or a couple places you'd like to mention?
Yeah, well, so English Learner Success Forum, the organization that I work with, it's a forum of educational leaders, whether it be researchers, practitioners, educational leaders on the bureaucratic side. It's a forum of folks that have come together and created a set of guidelines for quality instructional materials that are inclusive of the needs of multilingual learners. And we use those guidelines. We engage lots of people in the field to help content developers to iteratively improve their materials to be more reflective of those students. And so we have ELA math science guidelines. We've now developed ELD guidelines for designated ELD materials. And so those are really important, but we also have for educational leaders looking to kind of really think more deeply about the criteria for adoption. We have what are called benchmarks of quality.
Mm-hmm.
And those benchmarks, that this is a tool that educational leaders can take away with them. They're freely available on our website, and they can take away with them and look at their own criteria and their adoption processes and see if they are reflective of these research-backed quality indicators. So to just kind of do that crosswalk and make sure that their criteria are reflective of that diversity. So those are freely available. Our guidelines are freely available. We have lots of resources on our website. We have a set of do's and don'ts for teachers in teaching multilingual learners, and these are written by researchers and practitioners. So each one is authored by both a researcher. For example, we might have Jeff Zweers,
Mm-hmm.
write about conversations in the classroom alongside a teacher who's actually teaching multilingual learners. And they write a set of best practices around conversations, like effective academic conversations in the classroom. So that's just one example of a do's and don'ts that we have on our website. But there's lots of juicy resources for both educational leaders and for content developers there. And folks can feel free to, my information is up on the website. People can feel free to reach out to me at rskarin@elsuccessforum.org. My email is on the website, or to any of our other directors or leaders.
Perfect. Yeah. And for what it's worth, I've been on the website quite a bit, and it is really, really useful. So I'd highly recommend it. And the keyword that you said, there's a lot of free resources there, but they're not only free, but they're also high quality. So that's kind of what we look for to make it equitable for folks. So there's a good entry point there for anybody who's interested. And we'll link to that so that folks can find it. And Renae, with that, I want to thank you so much for joining us on Highest Aspirations. This was really a great conversation and a nice follow-up to the one that we had with Crystal, a little bit more current. And I'm definitely interested in learning more about the work that you're doing moving forward and where this all goes, because I think we're just at the beginning here. But if you're listening, let's help keep the momentum going here, because it's going to take a village to make this work happen.
Yeah, thank you so much, Steve, for the opportunity to talk about something I'm very passionate about, and to continue to beat the drum for multilingual learners in our classrooms, and better classroom experiences for them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.